Welcome to Free Thoughts, a podcast project of the Cato Institute's Libertarianism.org. Free Thoughts is a show about libertarianism and the ideas that influence it. I'm Aaron Powell, a research fellow here at Cato and editor of Libertarianism.org.
And I'm Trevor Burrus, a research fellow at the Cato Institute Center for Constitutional Studies.
Our topic for today's episode is how we talk about politics. And joining us to talk about that is Arnold Kling, an adjunct scholar at the Cato Institute and author of The Three Languages of Politics. I think most of us, if you ask, how do we talk about politics in general, our response is something like angrily. There's vitriol and we all get mad about it and we yell at each other and whatnot. But you have, I guess, a more interesting theory than that, which you call the three languages of politics. Can you tell us just what that is?
Sure. And it may relate to this intuitive notion that we talk about it angrily. When I listened to your podcast from a couple months ago on politics and primitivism, it struck me that maybe in the light of that I should have called this the three war whoops of politics. That these
the rebel yell, yeah.
This is a tribal way of talking about politics. And I want to make clear that these are using the term languages, I don't think these aren't three theories, these aren't three ideologies, these are related to three ideologies. So first of all, I divide the world into three ideologies: progressivism, conservatism, and libertarianism. A lot of people just want to do two. I'm going to want to give libertarians a third one. And the languages, very briefly, are axes of sort of what is good and what is evil. So what is most good on the progressive side is to be on the side of the oppressors. So there's this on the side of the oppressed. Good. What is good for progressives would be a side of the oppressed. So there's a strong oppressor-oppressed axis. Oppressors are bad. People who progressives hate, they accuse of being on the side of the oppressors. That includes libertarians and conservatives. People that they admire are people who they believe are on the side of the oppressed. So they like to occupy Wall Street because they think of it as being on the side of the oppressed. Then we have conservatives whose axis is civilization and barbarism. And so they view the worst evil as going back toward barbarism. And part of the reason they're conservative is they think that we've accumulated institutions and cultural norms that have taken us away from barbarism. And any threat to those institutions and cultural norms threatens to take us back in the direction of barbarism. And so people who they regard as being on the side of going back to barbarism are their worst enemy, and the people they admire are the people who've been the defenders of civilization. And for libertarians, the axis is freedom versus coercion. So the evil are people who use government coercion, and the good are people who fight government coercion. And again, I want to emphasize that these aren't the essence of their ideology, but they are, I think, the way that they organize the world in terms of we, they, really good, really bad. Mm-hmm. So when they're really in their primitivist mode of thinking about politics, they fall back on these things. So it's as a language, if you use that language, it's a way of signaling to the people who agree with you, this is how we line up on this issue, folks. It's clearly oppressors versus oppressed, or it's clearly civilization versus barbarians, or it's clearly freedom versus coercion. And it's also a way of castigating the opposition.
Maybe you could give us an example, like take a particular one policy issue or one thing that we talk about when we talk about politics, and maybe show how each of the three languages might approach it?
Sure. Pick an issue.
Terrorism.
Okay, so terrorism, that one's one of the more difficult ones for both the progressives and the libertarians, I think, because it's such it obviously seems to fall into civilization versus barbarism. Mm-hmm. And the terrorists are barbarians, and we in civilization have to fight back. let's take something like the Boston Marathon bombing, which so it was easiest for conservatives to put it in their civilization versus barbarism story. And you could see others having trouble. So the Libertarians, for when there were complaints right after the incident was resolved about the tanks in the street. Like we had tanks in our streets in Boston, and
people under house arrest, basically.
Yeah. So that they wanted to put it in the freedom versus coercion axis. And on the left, there was this marvelous piece where a guy wrote, I really hope it was a white male who did it. That sort of he wanted to be done by an oppressor, someone who's legitimately in the oppressor class, a white male, as opposed to somebody who might be regarded as coming from the oppressed class, such as a Muslim.
Mm-hmm. Are these like exclusive ways of looking at things, such that everything, if you're say conservative, then everything is a matter of civilization versus barbarism, and you don't really think so much, like you don't value freedom and coercion or oppressor oppressed as much, or is it more just an emphasis of how we talk?
Well, again, go back to the language story. So I don't think – I think the ideologies are complicated and they allow for people to think along all these axes and all about other things as well. I mean, there's certainly that's not the only thing. But sort of when a crunch comes and you need to reaffirm that your ideology is right – and to reaffirm that the other guy is wrong, I think these are the languages that people fall back on an amazing amount of time.
And I think one of the reasons I like your theory so much is because we see it – you can see how a word is used in a different way that evokes a different type of oppressor type of regime. Immigration is one where you kind of look at immigrants as either being lawbreakers, or we talk about how we want to ban the word illegal. Right, we don't want to say the word illegal anymore. We want to use the word unregistered or undocumented worker, because that sort of removes it from the civilization, barbarism, lawbreaker type of motif.
Yeah, no, immigration is a classic issue where people tend to look at it through the three languages. So the most important thing to a conservative is that they've broken the law, the illegal immigrants, and the most important thing to the progressives is that these people, are poor and come from poor countries. I mean, if the illegal immigrants consisted entirely of sort of rich capitalists, it would be interesting to see how the progressives would come out. They might very well look at it differently.
Be against
it, and for libertarians, it's government coercion that's going to be kicking these people out of the country. So they should be. We shouldn't have the borders to begin with, in one extreme libertarian view.
Yeah, it seems like you almost came up with a theory to explain why pundits become bigger idiots over time. And that's one thing I read your book. It's like pundits are not actually in the place, and they're not playing the game of convincing the other side as much, or it seems like.
That's actually how I ended up coming up with the theory and writing the book, is that the thing that I noticed that kind of made me go in that direction is that so much of what's written, either in blogs or in newspaper columns, if you think about it, it's just not going to convince anybody on the other side. It's not trying to change – it really wouldn't change the mind of someone who disagreed. It isn't designed to change the mind of the people who are on your side. And when I said, what it's really trying to do, and this is really sad – is that it's being done to try to keep the people on your side from changing their mind. It's trying to make it less likely that people on your side will change your mind. That's the most that's trying to accomplish. So I said, well, given that, if I were a conservative trying to reinforce conservatives' views, how would I write? And then I came up with the civilization barbarism thing, and same with the others.
Is it – so, I mean, you use words like it's designed to do these things, or they're setting out to keep conservatives thinking one way as opposed to setting out to convince progressives or libertarians. Do you think it's that conscious, or do you think that It's also that, if I'm a conservative, so I'm naturally prone to see things in this barbarism versus civilization way, then when I go to construct an argument, the argument that sounds the most convincing to me, so therefore it might be the most convincing, I think, to other people, is going to be a civilization barbarism argument.
I think it's probably more the latter, that people that these are the types of things that they find convincing, and so I think in some ways they're surprised that they don't convince other people. So when the Weekly Standard headlines its post-Boston Marathon headline "Civilization and Barbarism," I think they're surprised that anyone would think about it differently. But I think that comes a little bit from people talking among themselves. So if you had a room full of libertarians, sooner or later they'll start, getting animated. Oh, those people! All they wanted is power. All they want to do is strengthen the government and use power to take away people's freedom. You get a bunch of conservatives together, and eventually they'll say, they're just a bunch of barbarians. They just want to destroy our civilized values. So a little bit is group reinforcement. I think a lot of it is ultimately selection bias. So people who are inclined to try to understand someone else's point of view and talk in a way that would persuade them are probably selected away from in the political columnist world, maybe even in the blogosphere. It's otherwise. I think it's a lot easier for me to explain, a Rush Limbaugh or a Paul Krugman by saying, well, that's what the market seems to want. People want reinforcement for their own point of view. They don't want their own point of view challenged, and they're really not that interested in people who can talk to to people on different persuasions and change their minds.
So does this mean then that if we want to be more effective in communicating our ideas, it would help us to learn these other languages? I'm thinking about early on in the Free Thoughts podcast, we had Matt Zielinski on to talk, and he's from the Bleeding Heart Libertarians blog, and that they tend to speak to progressives. It's their mission, but there's this sense that they're trying to talk progressive into libertarianism, and one of the things that they do is emphasize, and he emphasized, the oppressive force. It's an oppressor-oppressed axis. It's the poor are being oppressed by the powerful controlling, government, and the powerful who are in league with government, and so we're talking this particular language.
Yeah, I would say nice try, but I think it's I'm kind of careful at the end of the book saying I don't think this is going to magically enable you to persuade other people. I think first of all, people are just very suspicious, so they say, "Well, yeah, but you're saying that, but I know you're a libertarian, so you're really on the side of the oppressor, and I see through that. You got that wrong."
Feels inauthentic in the same way as when the political parties try to speak to millennials by adopting their language. Or when your
parents come down and tell you that they like your band. I've heard those crazy new rock bands you're listening to. You're not really speaking my language, Dad.
Yeah. I think it's hard to make that sound authentic, and I think it's not really the way progressives use the word repress it, and they don't. I don't think they have any kind of natural inclination to think of government as an oppressor on economic issues. I think they're willing to think of it in terms of like privacy invasion, but that's an issue where libertarians and progressives are aligned to begin with.
So the feedback loop, though, is what strikes me as interesting. We could talk about this as a method of sort of dog whistling or using the language of people that you're hanging around. You bring up libertarians, when libertarians hang out together, the word statist often comes out in a way that it doesn't come out around other people. So it could be just a way of talking about it, but there's also some sort of feedback loop, I think, between the quality and nature of your beliefs and why you believe them in terms of the fundamentals, and then engaging in this type of rhetoric that maybe changes your beliefs itself in terms of who you think you're opposing, what the other side looks like to you in terms of homogenizing them into a group that's just against you.
Yeah, no, I do think that one of the ultimate end stages is to not just think of these axes as sort of things in the abstract and there are evil people along the opposite axis, but you actually get to the point where you're convinced that anyone who's in the group who disagrees with you actually ultimately is part of that evil axis. So again, read any Paul Krugman column and see him describe, in which he usually does, conservatives are libertarians, and it's clear that they're just oppressors, and that that's about as far as his thought process goes. And I was sort of disappointed to read is it Jason Brennan's book where he says, well, basically we have got conservatives who want to have a nanny state. And that's not, again, how conservatives would describe themselves. It's not a very generous way of talking about
a police state, I think you said conservatives.
Well, the liberals want the nanny state. The conservatives want the police state.
Okay, right. Okay, so yeah, that's not a good way to open up a dialogue with somebody who disagrees with you, and it's also not a good way to educate the people who agree with you about what those ideologies really are about.
Yeah, there's a general rule I use in a lot of different situations, which am I using any words to describe someone that they would not use to describe themselves, right? And the one I use all the time is brainwashed is a really good example. And you say, well, you're just brainwashed. Because no one ever says, I'm brainwashed. And it's a good indication of whether or not you're not speaking the right language or not categorizing their beliefs with enough respect, really.
Yeah. Well, Brian Kaplan developed this phrase, an ideological Turing test. Imagine that you were placed in a room, let's say, with a bunch of progressives. Could you articulate progressivism in a way that they would say, oh, yeah, that is. And I think that going back to your question about Matselinsky and the
poor,
and the poor being oppressed by government, I don't think you could talk that way in a room among of progressives and sound like a progressive. I think people would instantly tune in something and say, I heard something a little weird there. I think we've got a traitor in our midst.
Yeah, if you say minimum wage law is oppressing the poor, they're probably going to say, "Oh, he's a witch.
Yeah.
He's a witch. Get him."
Get him out
of here.
Yeah, you can say there are studies that show that the minimum wage reduces employment among low-skilled workers, and you can be okay. But you start using the language of oppressive on that one, and they're not going to.
Well, or it seems anything that would shift whatever group you're talking to into the suspect class is going to be because when you're arguing that government hurts the poor, especially these programs that are often designed to help the poor, then what you're really saying is you progressives who are supporting this, if it's true that the poor are being oppressed, are now a member of the oppressor class in the same way that conservatives talking about civilization versus barbarism, whatever their particular policy preferences are, those are never barbaric. Even though, as a libertarian standing outside of it, looking at policies that are preferred by American conservatives, many of them look awfully barbaric to me.
Or you could just, if you're against waterboarding, you could say, well, waterboarding is a pretty barbaric thing, and but that's not the
that's not going to fly.
That's not the way to gain entree into the or to start to convince conservatives.
Your rubric also reminds me of one of the other virtues of it is that there are a lot of sort of pop-sci political books out there, but many of them read as sort of attempts to explain why you're right through some sort of language or cognitive neuroscience. George Lakoff is a neuroscientist who became a Democrat strategist, and he wrote a book called Don't Think of an Elephant, and he had this whole theory that the reasons that conservatives were winning he considered the last 30 years of conservatives being winning was because they were using words like death tax rather than estate tax that put a spell on your brain, and basically that he had to come up with an explanation for how anyone could believe this, and his explanation was basically witchcraft. It was some sort of I've got into your brain and done witchcraft on it.
Lakoff's a very interesting character, and I really want to distinguish my project from his. Again, I'm not trying to explain why people believe they do or to summarize ideologies. I'm trying to summarize rhetoric in some sense. I'm trying to I think the war whoop story really is right. If we view politics as primitivism, as sort of whipping your tribe up and into a frenzy, I think that is what I see these languages as doing. But Lakoff, the first book of his that came to my attention, I think it was his first foray into the whole political stuff was
Don't Think of an Elephant?
No, it was before that. It was
morals, yeah.
moral politics.
The daddy and the mommy system.
So that conservatives have this strict father morality and liberals have a nurturant parent morality. And so it was very interesting. I think he probably is on to something that rhetoric of a nurturant parent, that people can succeed if they're given all the resources they need, is rhetoric that appeals to a progressive. And I think the strict parent, people need to be punished if they step out of line. That has a conservative thing. It appeals to conservatives. Where I think he flew off the rails is that he then proceeded to look at studies of parenting and say that nurturant parents is a better model. Okay, fine, maybe that's true. I'm not going to argue with it. But then to say, well, therefore, conservatism is clearly wrong, as if the analogy between a family and government is 100% perfect, and so any way that you run a family that's better is clearly the better way to run government. It's like, whoa, how did you make that leap? And
he came to a class of mine in law school one time because my professor was friends with him, and he gave his shtick, and again, it has some validity to it up to a point, and then it sort of crosses a line into now I'm explaining why they're crazy and we're sane, and then you start to look at it and say, this now you're just part of the problem. You're not explaining anything. You're part of the problem. And he stood up there and he said the problem with Democrats is that we're too rational. And I was my head was spinning, not because I think Democrats are inherently irrational, but it goes out to my comment about if you wouldn't call yourself then you're probably playing some different game. You'd be like, well, as a Republican, I'm irrational.
That's why I'm Republican.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And everyone thinks that their beliefs are too complex to say in bumper sticker logic. That's what you say. They have bumper sticker logic. We have very complex and deep-seated reasons for believing what we want to do. And that's exactly one thing he told me. He said, conservatives can put their logic on a bumper sticker, whereas I need a bumper sticker that's huge that explains how complex my beliefs actually are. So again, it's still just thoughtless.
Yeah, I think everyone believes that. And there's and one of my favorite pieces of literature that I cited in the book is and I'm forgetting the term the guy used for it, but basically we believe that we understand our opponents better than they understand themselves. That's just a very powerful belief. He wasn't even talking about it initially in terms of politics. That anyone that you happen to be on the other side of, we believe that we understand them not only really well, but better than they understand themselves. We understand their true motives. And if you're at that point, it's almost hopeless for you to be able to engage or accept any possibility that their ideas are correct or anything. You're really that's really far gone.
I'm curious about the civilization barbarism as the conservative and the freedom coercion as the libertarian distinction, because I'm thinking of a lot of conservative rhetoric of, especially since Obama came into office, and then the rise of the Tea Party, and then the way conservatives talk about, say, Obamacare. There's a huge amount of freedom language going on there. They want to coerce you into having the government's choice in healthcare. They want to take away your freedom to do this. The Tea Party is very much steeped in the language of freedom and liberty first. Is that a change in conservatism? Is it a different kind of conservatism, or are they using those terms, say, differently than the way that libertarians do?
I think there's some overlap, but probably not much. There's also a lot of rhetoric on Obama that sort of makes him out as being on the side of barbarianism.
Even the Kenyan thing, to some extent, you could say the Kenyan thing, you could say, is almost part of that.
Yeah, and the recent issue of being the Crimean situation, I kind of look at it and say, well, it's a lot closer to Russia than it is to us. I don't know what I would do about it if I were president, but the idea that if he were more of a defender of civilization, that this would not have happened is very much part of the conservative rhetoric. And some of them were raving right-wing talk show hosts will actually say, well, this is what Obama's trying to do. He's trying to undermine America. And I think there's been a lot of conservative rhetoric that we need to take back our country. That is, I think, a dog whistle along the civilization barbarism axis.
Yeah. And that would be the talking constantly about the Constitution. The Constitution represents kind of the high water mark. The Constitution, as the founders saw it, represents the high water mark of civilization, and Obama is trying to undermine that, and so that's a deviation from.
Yeah, and it's interesting. So libertarians and conservatives can align on the Constitution, but the libertarians, what's important to them is their reading of it and its use as a way to constrain government power. And I think as for conservatives, it is more of a symbol of civilization, of the tradition. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think Aaron's question about using the term freedom is interesting too, because you even heard this in Obamacare debates, and you still hear it to some extent today. Well, what is freedom if you might have a catastrophic healthcare problem, and then you won't be free to pay for that on your own ability, which again may be them just trying to co-opt the supporters of Obamacare, trying to co-opt freedom rhetoric and say, "Come on board, freedom lovers," and us saying, "I don't think that word means what you think it means."
Yeah.
Well, that was the argument when the study came out that showed that Obamacare would increase unemployment, that people would leave the labor market. That this was the freedom to not work.
Yes,
being enhanced by this.
Yes,
your comments about Obama too, and making him on the side of barbarism. I think one of the fascinating things that you've seen with Obama has been the pathologizing of Obama. This happens a lot, as you said. We think we understand our opponents better than they understand themselves. So you have to come up with some deep-seated mental reason, such as Dinesh D'Souza's post-colonial explanation of how to try and explain why Obama is a milquetoast liberal politician who advocates the same physicians they've been advocating for 20 years. We need to give him a psychoses because he doesn't have reasons; he has pathologies.
Yeah, well, but as you were saying earlier, that's kind of the favorite thing of academic psychologists is to say, well, conservatives, basically you were born with a fear of spiders, and ultimately that turns you into conservative.
I'm wondering if this makes – because you said you kind of refrain from drawing conclusions about how we ought so we ought to change our language in a certain way, or here's ways we can now try to talk to each other. But I'm wondering does this represent something that's making our political lives worse? Because it's not so much – if this is true, then it's not just that we disagree with each other and that we can disagree with each other over really important things, but that on top of that – we can't even talk to each other about it in a meaningful way.
It's not I would phrase it I'd say that the problem is that we layer onto it so much of, and I'll go back to your primitivism, so much tribal
us versus them.
And that we make it we make the disagreements more emotional and more intense and put much higher stakes on them than we need to. So if I were to prescribe anything to people, it would be like, the ideal thing is, so if everybody in the world read this book and took it to heart, they would take a step backward every time they hear these sorts of dog whistles, especially when the dog whistle comes from their own side, and say, aha, this is just a dog whistle from my own side, but let's see it analytically. Let's imagine what this would look like from other people's point of view. Let's see if I can look at the facts. And I'm not promising I would all of a sudden change my libertarian views. I'm not inclined to. But at least I think it would be a step forward if people recognize that, I'm responding to a dog whistle here. Wait a minute. Let me try to take a broader view.
You say that these don't. These don't define the underlying ideology, right? But what I'm wondering is, so Yeah, so progressivism, the ideology is not one of just oppressor-oppressed, that there's whole aspects to it that then define
belief in human
things,
progress.
Right.
That's part of progressivism.
And conservatism has all these things. But libertarianism, I mean, really reduced to its core, just is a focus on freedom versus coercion. I mean, especially if you take the kind of really, the more extreme views, like so a strict like non-aggression principle libertarian is going to say, well, all there is to my ideology, in fact, is freedom versus coercion. So I can't really talk about anything else when it comes to politics because that's all there is to it.
That might be true of somebody who's sort of comes at it from what I call the philosophical point of view, but there's also people come at it from the pragmatic point of view. In fact, one of my favorite thinkers, Jeffrey Friedman, says that libertarians tend to, like when one fails, they fall back on the other. So when they're saying, philosophically, the non-aggression principle, and then something comes up that maybe that principle just doesn't completely persuade, then they fall back. Well, but on a practical level, when you allow more freedom, people, you get more economic growth and people are better off. And conversely, the people who are libertarian more for, you get more economic growth, people are better off. When they come across an issue where maybe that doesn't work, they fall back. Yeah, but philosophically, people ought to be free. So in any case, I think there are those two pillars that sort of uneasily support libertarianism. There's the empirical case for free markets producing better results, and then there's the philosophical, that no one should be able to force somebody else to do something against their will. And people kind of go back and forth with those two.
Well, I do think it's true that when it comes to the moral languages of politics, we don't spend as much time talking about the efficacy of markets as we do talking about the problems of freedom versus coercion and why a life well lived is without coercion or with as little coercion as you possibly can.
And I think, honestly, libertarians make more progress with non-libertarians when they make the utilitarian case for libertarianism rather than the absolutist, rightist, natural rights case.
Yeah, and speaking for myself, that I've considered myself a libertarian for quite a long time, but until I came in here and started hanging out with a lot of libertarians, I was pretty much entirely just consequentialist and didn't have a big anti-authoritarian streak in me. I'm not very anti-authoritarian. I've become more anti-authoritarian as I hang around people speaking the same language of anti-authoritarianism. There's the, well, we shouldn't really make people do this because it produces bad outcomes, and then there's the don't tell me what to do type of attitude, which I think it brings out – libertarians bring that out in each other.
It's interesting. I think my background, my personality was very anti-authoritarian all my life, and I came to my libertarian policy beliefs rather late. So different direction.
So the question here is also what do we do? That doesn't seem like there's very much of an audience for sort of plain-spoken, non-dog whistling type of pundits out there. It seems like the world is spreading apart, and there's not a place for people who want to have a nice discussion about the issues.
No, I think we should become depressed. I don't. That seems to be my conclusion in every
time.
Yeah. Every time I'm in a public setting, my conclusion. Let's all get depressed.
Have you looked at this historically? Like looked at the arguments from, say, 100 years ago to see if these same sorts of things are there or if it's getting worse? Or?
I was very careful in the book to say this is contemporary. I didn't want to rule out that it was true historically, but I didn't want to make any claims like that would immediately get me shot down by somebody who understood the history of political philosophy better than I do. It'd be interesting to take something I read Yuval Levin's book on Burke versus Paine.
Oh, the Great Debate.
Yeah. And it'd be interesting. I should have said, as I read it, I should have looked for passages that lined up this way, but I didn't. I didn't do that. I'd have to go back and see.
Well, I think some of this could definitely be tied in. I mean, we can talk about how you talk about it, how we talk about it, but also the more fundamental issues of why do we believe what we believe, and some of the stuff like John Haidt's work on the fundamentals of political psychology, that there are, is this fair, is this unfair, is this disgusting, is this not? Those are what really undergirds our sense of that this is wrong or not, and then we get involved with groups and start using words to rally each other around ideas around the white hats versus the black hats. And
yeah, I think I have mixed feelings about that. I certainly like a lot of what Haidt has done. I particularly didn't feel like the disgust, the extent to which people feel disgust works the way he thinks it does. Because I look at the progressives' attitude to things like obesity or genetically modified organisms, and I say, if that's not a disgust issue, what is it? Mm-hmm. I guess, certainly with genetically modified organisms, it's really the utilitarian case is almost all against them. The scientific case is almost all against them. So, to me, thinking that I know my opponents better than they know themselves, they think that that's a disgust issue. I also, there's the attempts to explain conservatism in these kinds of psychological terms. Like, this isn't Haidt, but people who I think feel like they're carrying his banner say that conservatism is fundamentally about endogamy, that you don't want to see marriage outside your tribe, and so that leads to your views on immigration, it leads to your views on sex and so on, and that
seems like a dog whistle itself.
Yeah, that struck me as too much of a stretch because I don't quite get how that explains conservative views on foreign policy or for free markets, or throwing that all into the endogamy story seems like way too much.
That's one of the things I like about your way of looking at things as opposed to, say, Haidt's, which for those who aren't familiar with this, that Haidt's a psychologist and he gives people questionnaires on moral questions and has them talk about whether they think this is morally right or wrong, and uses those to tease out their views on what he calls the moral foundations, which are things like disgust and purity, or authority,
freedom and coercion is one of them,
harm, fairness. And his thesis then is that different political groups kind of feel more of an affinity towards certain foundations than others. So conservatives are pulled more by things that represent authority issues than they are by fairness issues,
and also disgust for them too.
So,
but I agree with Arnold.
But I think one of the issues with this is exactly the one that you got at with disgust. And when I reviewed the book for the Cato Journal, I made a similar sort of argument that he says, so he puts these questions out there meant to provoke fairness or not, and then says, progressives score high on fairness, which is then why they support these given policies, because these are policies that are about fairness. And as a non-progressive, I look at them and say, no, I support fairness, but I believe that these are not fair. I'm looking at the policy differently as opposed to the moral foundation. I think what makes sense in opposition to that about your theory is that the underlying policy preferences, because this is one of the problems with Haidt's theory, is it doesn't seem to fit with policy preferences changing within these groups over time. Yours allows for this so they could – conservatives can oppose the individual mandate on all of these grounds when it's a Democrat doing it. But when it's a Republican doing it in Massachusetts, they can support it totally. And your theory says that doesn't cause a problem for your theory.
And in part that's because Romney's rhetoric was this is going to keep the people from abusing the emergency rooms. And that's barbaric. People using the emergency rooms and not paying for it. This is good. whereas Obama was using different rhetoric for it. I think that's a good point. Let me cite another thing that Jeffrey Friedman suggests, that you not try to reduce anyone's point of view, that you don't take a reductionist attitude, say you believe this because. Just say, all right, take their beliefs on face value. Just whatever, just use that as an operating principle. Take the beliefs at face value. And so I wanted to be careful with the book and say, well, I'm not trying to explain why a progressive believes what they want to do. I'm just saying once you form your beliefs, however you believe them, when you're trying to whip up your own side, you're going to end up falling back on this kind of rhetoric.
And I think that brings in with sort of good thinking habits of taking what they say on their face and not trying to dig down into them. And I tell people all the time that you have to believe that, or you need to understand that the other side has good arguments. They don't just have idiocy. They have good arguments, and you won't be able to combat them if you don't think that those are good arguments. All these things that go into good thinking, and sometimes you can feel yourself get pulled into the dog whistle camp and the bad thinking comes in, and you say, okay, I need to stop that.
Yeah. Well, actually, and now I remember the term I was looking for that thing, which is the law of asymmetric insight, the belief that you understand other people better than they understand themselves, and that's what I'm trying to kind of avoid slipping into, and it's very easy to slip into that one. And also, just as an aside, I think that some of this political psychology ends up doing that, ironically. These are psychologists. They're supposed to understand these things, but they are actually probably guilty of asymmetric insight in sort of thinking that they understand the conservative mindset better than that they don't need to take conservative points of view at face value.
So then I know that you have resisted the kind of normative conclusions from your book. Instead of just describing the way things are, I'm not giving recommendations on then how to change the way we talk in order to be more effective, but are you, in a sense, saying the solution, one thing we should do is not necessarily try to adopt the other side's rhetorical style when talking to them, or try to adopt all three, but instead to try to step outside of this, that it's a negative normative sense?
And certainly restrain your own rhetoric. So the most extreme use of the rhetoric would, let's say for a libertarian, would be to say that all they want is power. Just say, okay, no, wait, I'm going to step back and take what they say at face value. I'm concerned that if we followed through on that policy that we would be ending up with more government power and more coercion, but I'm going to take at face value that that's not the fundamental purpose of it. And then in terms of your own rhetoric, just there's no need to sort of whip your side into a frenzy over these issues. So if the NSA spying thing comes out, you don't have to sort of jump up and down and scream, that's coercion, that's going to get rid of freedom. You can say, well, what can we do about that? I guess these people are very concerned about terrorism. That's probably a legitimate concern, but what is it about this that might be different? And for example, in that particular example, David Brin has a very different take on that, which is that the technology's here, your ability to stop anyone from using that technology, it's unlikely. What we need is more symmetry in the ability to use it. So we should have as much of a window into government as government has into us, and that's a very difficult point of view to accept. It's difficult for the super people who
privacy
the privacy advocates or people who fear government to say we're going to give government that power, and somehow the fact that we have transparency into them is going to be good enough to counteract that. And then the people in government, transparency. What you're going to watch us? The police are going to be filmed while they're doing their job. That's
Yeah. No. In our episode that we did with Nick Gillespie and Matt Welch, he had a a line. Nick had a line that said, we should avoid the soda tax Buchenwald type of arguments that the soda tax is the same as a concentration camp, or this is the beginning of the end of human civilization, which we're prone to. And I always say it would be amazing if we could actually discuss these issues on the margins as opposed to the extremes, which is something that I bring up in my primitivism of politics stuff, which is very similar to what you say, extremifying your opponent, homogenizing them, and not actually addressing the fact that there's close calls between you two on the margins. I do that in gun policy all the time. I'd rather debate on the margins than on the you want a rocket launcher versus you want to disarm every person on the planet. Let's have a fight in the middle about that. That's not even a good debate.
Yeah.
You said you haven't really looked at this historically, so we can't talk about trend lines of this is getting worse or it's getting better than it used to be. But I'm still curious if you have any opinions about whether the way government currently is, whether the size, the scope of its powers, the kind of policies we have, the kind of policies that we argue for make this problem potentially worse than it might otherwise be.
Yeah, no, my instinct is that it's worse. It's worse than it was. I can even remember the '60s when politics was quite polarized, and I think in some ways it's worse. There was definitely more of a violent fringe back in the '60s, and that was concerning. But I think what is worse is that people feel more threatened by the notion that they might have to change their minds. So, in the 60s, an awful lot of people changed their minds about the Vietnam War, and they were able to deal with that. And in the 70s, a lot of people changed their minds about the usefulness of wage and price controls. They tried it, and pretty much everyone now agrees that experiment didn't work. And
deregulation too.
Yeah.
Also in the late 70s.
Yeah, the deregulation of transportation involved changing minds. Now I think and this is true on all sides, but I certainly notice it on the progressive side, maybe because I want to believe that their own self-image, that they're the reality-based, intelligent, well-educated group. I get the sense that and this is accusing them of psychological, but of having a harder time changing their minds. So I think that the trend is, to use these languages more and more. And that is either coincident with or causing a resistance to changing one's mind. I guess I wish I could come up with more issues on which I felt libertarians and conservatives needed to change their minds.
The drug war for conservatives would be potentially one.
Well, and that's one that some of them have. Yeah, I think. Well, maybe immigration would be a classic one. That getting conservatives. So there's an interesting one where I have a feeling that the differences between the elite and the mass are kind of the more important than any kind of the ideological ones. But I can certainly think of things where, I think there's room for progressives to change their mind, like the effectiveness of fiscal policy, of big deficits on improving the economy. I mean, they're really dug in on that. I think that those of us who don't agree that deficits really help the economy grow and reduce unemployment, that we're just out to screw the unemployed, or that we have no sense of science at all. And yet, I think an objective reading of the data would say, boy, that's really a questionable call whether that makes a difference. It seems like we ran a huge deficit and unemployment went up. We had the sequester and these things that the progressives say, that's going to cause, it's austerity, it's going to cause a recession, and the economy did okay. So I think that it's part of a general trend for people to dig in your question of sort of why that, why are people digging in more? One possibility is it's structural, that the government has become bigger, more important. It's a very comforting idea from a libertarian point of view. Hey, they wouldn't have these fights if government weren't so big. I'm more inclined to take a soft cultural view that people, for whatever reason, have taken on their political beliefs as a stronger part of their identity. So, and my evidence for that would be something like on Facebook, the amount of political stuff, even from friends from just that I've friended because they're my high school friends. So it's not like, it'd be one thing if all my friends were people from the Washington area who I knew from my, political economic.
Yeah.
These are people that just happened to gone to high school with, and they're like posting, their political rhetoric, or people that I worked with when I had my business, and we had no political discussions at all, but with their Facebook posts are all political. So I think people are, it's a bigger part of their identity. And again, I go back to the 60s and 70s. People identified, there was the jocks versus the long hair, jocks versus greasers, and there were these, all these cultural divides and so on, all these ways of people identified themselves, but it wasn't all politics. And I think that the salience of politics and people's identity has gone up, and that is creating this kind of extreme polarization, or is coinciding with it. I
think that's one of the real dangers of that is that the difference between the various cliques, if you're part of a clique in high school, or you identify very strongly as like a Boston sports fan versus New York sports fans or whatever, these other kind of –
Aaron does, by the way. Or Patriots.
Yes. Yeah. But is that those are relatively harmless lines to draw upon, so I can like totally hate the New York Jets and think that there's something just like morally deficient with their fans.
Which he does tweet them at A.
Otherwise they wouldn't be Jets fans. Yeah. But I don't see those people as enemies. But the difference is when we start getting our cultural identity from politics is that there are policies attached to those, and those policies end up seeing us forcing other people to live.
You're libertarian,
but I think it encourages us to see each other as when we identify politically, as opposed to along these other lines. It encourages us to see each other more as enemies than we might have otherwise, which I think is then a deeply harmful. I think the fewer people you see as your outright enemies, probably the better your life is going to go.
Yeah, I definitely. This circles back to sort of the politics as primitivism issue. I think I'd much rather see people's primitive urges go into, sports stadiums than in politics. But maybe that's just my libertarian inclination. I mean, my inclination is to think that, if you had a continuum of primitivism and
maybe civilization,
or just
barbarism.
Yeah, right.
Peacefulness.
That the most civilized way to live is live and let live. If your idea of a good day is to curl up with a good book inside, and my idea of good day is to take a hike in the woods, we each do our own thing, and that just seems like the most civilized way to live. And the most primitive is for us to beat each other up, and then somewhere in between we could take votes and do things like that. And I guess I think that the taking a vote is closer to or maybe that's kind of your insight, is that taking a vote is closer to the beating each other up than it is to the live and let live.
Depends on what you're voting about. Yeah.
Yeah.
I liked your comment though about and I think about this as I'm working on the book on this. That you don't want to make sure that you're just justifying your libertarian view of the world in terms of this rubric you set up, which is a point well taken. But when you bring in the social aspects and comparing how much of your identity might be tied up with politics, that's a very good point, because this also could be tied to the diversification of culture across the board, the long tail effect of there being, not 3 networks anymore, not 3 bands anymore. Not there were more than 3 bands, but there are just more and more things that you can do, and that means that there are more things that you could assign a group mentality to. So Trader Joe's versus this, they start to have political ramifications. Whole Foods has a political undertone to it. Trader Joe's does that if you shop at a different type of grocery store, maybe it doesn't, and even bans and even those.
But that could have worked out the other way, right? It could have worked out that people's political heat turned down as they became more and more engaged in these other things, and with these wider opportunities. And one of the things that I remember Tyler Cowen writing a blog post about is that if there are a lot of areas to compete in, then there are a lot of different status games to play. And I may be the best connoisseur of a certain type of music, and that and I may have a tight in group of people who take my recommendations on that music, and that's a great in terms of my view of sort of a civilized versus primitive view, that would give us a more civilized life where we're less likely to run into conflicts with each other. Is that there are enough status games so that everybody can feel their high status at something. But if you load everything into politics, that seems like wow. You're bound to make a lot of people unhappy.
Let me push back just a bit on this, that kind of social science aspect of all of this a bit. Just say, we're having this conversation very much in the Beltway right now, and I know you said you see more political posts from your Facebook friends, but that could be because that's become the thing one does on Facebook, or when you post on Facebook, you get these little. It tells you how many people responded, and political things may get just more responses than, here's an article about bird watching or whatever. And so it incentivizes stuff like that. But is it possible that we living here in the Washington, D.C. area are, to at least some extent, over-reading how much people identify culturally with political groups, and that maybe outside in the rest of America – they can identify as Democrats or Republicans, but they're not thinking about it that much, and they're not identifying.
Yeah, so they're not reading the newspaper or looking at the web, and when they see something that's threatening to their side, getting all I got to do something about that. I got to write my blog post.
Or they're just not reading the newspaper and reading political pundits as much as we are.
They live a normal life.
Yeah, well, certainly that's true. I mean, you can just see in terms of the the percentage of non-voters and how that goes. Obama just complained about this, how that goes up during off-year elections. So yeah, I think that's true, but I think it's still kind of scary to the extent to which, at least among highly educated people, that there's a lot of identity. I mean, I just see it in friends. I mean, I don't know if you get this experience, but I get this experience because I have just about all my friends are on the left, and so you're sitting around a dinner table, and eventually the conversation comes back to how miserable the fact that that conservatives make them feel, and how angry they get. And it's like, I just want to crawl under the chair.
I want to thank you, Arnold, for coming on Free Thoughts today. And I wanted to close by just asking if our listeners have found this really interesting. Of course, they should buy the book, The 3 Languages of Politics.
It's only about 50 pages, so it's definitely worth it.
But then is there somewhere they can, say, find you online to get more of your thoughts?
Well, I have a weblog that's called Ask Blog, but I think if you Google Arnold Kling blog, sooner or later you get there. I used to blog elsewhere, but sooner or later you'll find this Ask Blog, and if you see a blog with current posts only by me, then you know you found it.
Thank you for listening to Free Thoughts. If you have any questions or comments about today's show, you can find us on Twitter at Free Thoughts Pod. That's Free Thoughts Pod. Free Thoughts is a project of Libertarianism.org and the Cato Institute and is produced by Evan Banks. To learn more about libertarianism, visit us on the web at www.libertarianism.org.